with another. We're in for a real treat tonight. We have with us Jeremiah Hamby. I tell people he's a walking Bible. He's been in college, remind me.
8 years this year.
8 years, and he's got at least another year and a half before he starts considering his doctrine. So very, very intelligent young man. He's my friend. Thank the world of Jeremiah. He's got a brother that I'm trying to get to sing tonight, but I don't think Josh is going to move, are you, Josh? No? Okay. We want to have our opening prayer, and then I'm going to turn the service over to Jeremiah. He's just got back from Israel, and he's got some stories to tell. If you would continue to remember Enrique Hester, Miss Melba Smith's son, hospice in Hudson, a lot of pain. Wade Silver's mother's funeral was postponed. It was supposed to have been today in South Carolina because of the storm. I do not have a future date yet. So continue praying for that family. We will have a funeral here tomorrow. Star Duggar's funeral. She died in Florida. Her funeral will be here at 4:30. The family will be receiving from 2:30 up to 4:30. Be remembering those folks. Mike Watson, our Brotherhood Director, would you open us in prayer, please? Amen. Jeremiah, we're honored to have you.
Glad to be here.
If you remember, Jeremiah spoke Baptist Men's Day. I don't think it was last year, maybe the year before.
Yeah.
On a Sunday morning, so you'll remember him maybe that way. And I'm going to let you introduce these folks right here. And in the hall, if you've not noticed, there's some beautiful things from her missionary days, Philippines, that she's in these beautiful cases behind me, going in 2 or 3 different places. But you tell the folks who's here to hear you, okay?
So, am I going? Am I live? Oh, there we go. Okay, yep. Let me just move this up a little bit. There we go. I'll try and speak up for you. I have some wonderful family here this evening, Faye and Paul Comer. Though technically they're distant relatives, they're definitely like family. They are, as Pastor mentioned, Faye was in the Philippines for a number of years serving in ministry, and Paul spent a good bit of his time in Texas as a pastor, both of them from Gardner Webb, where I currently am, so we have deep roots down in Boiling Springs, North Carolina, so I'm glad to have them here. Also, my Pawpaw Luther, as many of y'all know him, he's been here for quite a while at this church. My mom, Robin, my aunt and uncle, Becky and Larry, and then my brother, Joshua. I'm very excited to have them here to be able to talk about this. They haven't heard me give this whole spiel yet. They've heard a little bit about it, but they're getting it just like you are tonight. But so, like Pastor Sam said, I'm here to talk a little bit about Israel. And I was talking with one of my professors today, and I was describing it. I'm not giving you the highlights. That would take far too long. I'm giving you the highlights of the highlights here this evening. So, because we were there for 12 days, and to try and talk about all the many different things there, you could have me back about 5 or 10 more times, and we might cover enough ground. So what I'd like to do, because it's always good to be able to see the pictures of the places and whatnot, so what I've got first is about 6 minutes of just kind of some chronological pictures from the beginning of our trip to the end, with a little soundtrack behind it, just to watch that, to get some visuals about the land of Israel and our trip. And then I'm going to talk about just a few aspects of the trip here with you this evening. So, let's see if it will go or not. There we go. Hopefully. Technology will hopefully work. Let's see. Is there a play back on the screen? See if you can hover over the screen. There should be a play button potentially. And if not, we'll go right into me talking. Oh, I see what's happening. Okay, well, so technical difficulties always happen. So I will just simply go into talking about, and I've got some pictures along the way as well that we'll talk about as we go. So what I'm kind of calling our conversation this evening is just reflections on Israel. I started off planning tonight as trying to talk about just a few of the cities that we were at, and after about 30 slides, I decided that probably wasn't going to be enough time tonight to talk about even just a few of the cities. And so instead of just the 30,000-foot view, we're going to go up real high to about the 100,000-foot view to talk about a little bit about the Holy Land, the land of Israel. And so just to kind of show you where we're going, I've got all these fun visual aids along the way. Like I said, there's no way to cover the whole trip. I can't do it in an hour. I can do it if you gave me about a week. But I'm going to give you some highlights from it, and I'm going to start off by talking about the land of Israel, and we're going to look briefly at the book of Genesis, a passage from Genesis, and then I'm going to dive into the trip itself. We're going to talk a little bit about this land that's got a lot of the old world and a lot of the new world, this collision of worlds from the time of synagogues and walking everywhere to, while we were there, we rode a train between two different areas of the city of Jerusalem. So a collision of worlds going on. It's also a very small world. And for me, that was kind of an earth-shattering moment. I knew it wasn't big, but I didn't realize how small the land was. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the rich history. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about sacred spaces and what those are over there and a little bit about them as well. And then after that, I'm going to open it up in case any of you all have any questions for me about anything I've said, or if you've just got some curiosity about something over in Israel or something that you've heard that you'd like to ask about, I will do my absolute best to be able to answer any questions. So that's going to be kind of our game plan here this evening. So what I'd like to start off with is a passage from Genesis chapter 12, a very familiar passage to many of us in the church. It's the passage where God comes to Abraham. In Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Now the Lord had said to Abraham, "Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And so a part of this story, and what ends up being a very big part of this story, is this idea of this land. God is calling Abraham from his land, in the land of Ur, of the Chaldees, to go somewhere he's never seen before. But this land is going to be a part of what's going to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. And what this land is going to be the land of Israel, where the Israelite people are going to be able to settle eventually. They're going to be taken from their land. They're going to go down to Egypt. They're going to come back. They're going to go to Babylon. They're going to come back. And so, but it's this land, this space for them to be, and this place that many of us have the opportunity to go to every year and to experience and to see, to walk where Jesus walked, to see the rich history that's there. It's this land that is blessing all the generations right now in various ways. And we'll talk just a little bit about that. But I wanted to kind of open it up that way. And this also kind of reminded that land is important. I'd say it's important for many of us here because it's where we belong. It's where we grow. It's where we set roots down. It's where our families are. It's where our history's at. And so we become attached to the land. And the land of Israel, its roots go deeper, far deeper than we can even imagine. America is over 250 years old. But the history of Israel spans well over 2 millennia. We're but a speck in comparison to the rich history that's there. And so again, I won't be able to go into all of it, but we'll give a little bit of it. So, just some pictures of a few of our travelers. Up there in the top left corner, my wonderful girlfriend Mariah. She was able to come with us on this trip. And beside her, doing some pastoral care to the cat beside her, our pastoral care and counseling professor, Doug Dickens. In the blue, just to the right, a good friend of ours, Zach Dye. In the picture on the far right, we have Samir, who's in the gray ball cap, who was our tour guide there, a Palestinian Christian. And then the guy in the red is Dr. Robert Kanoy, our fearless leader, our dean of the Divinity School, who leads this trip every year. The one just below Zach, you can't quite see him super well, Dr. Gerald Cowan was our Old Testament professor going with us, also our closest thing we have to an expert in archaeology, having gone on multiple digs in the Middle East. He was able to give us some archaeological insights while we were there. And then on the right, just a few of our other travelers as well. But you'll see various other folks. We went with about 40 different people to the Holy Land, and so a big group, but it was quite an exciting group to have. So just to kind of get started, talking a little bit about this old and new world. And so it was quite fascinating. As you can see in that middle picture up towards the top, the light rail in Jerusalem blew my mind. When we got there about halfway through our trip, we arrived in Jerusalem, and I saw this light rail running down the middle of the road. If you'd asked me what I expected to see when I got to the Holy Land, it was not a train. I was not expecting that whatsoever. But it kind of reminded me that this land that we talk about, that we think about, I guess part of me knew that it changed since the Bible times, but then part of me didn't know that it changed since the Bible times because I'd never seen it. And so my imagination had just filled all the stories and filled in the gaps along the way as to what things were supposed to look like. But part of me said that it kept going, but then getting there, and as you see right below the train, you see "We Love Jericho" and the Pepsi symbol there. And so that was in the middle of downtown Jericho. And so it's just it was a lot to wrap your brain around. The fact that these old cities that we read about in the Bible, going back 2,000 plus years, have kept going since then into modern society, to where even though they were around then, they're still around now, but they're not like they were then. I'm still trying to get my head around that just a little bit, if you can't tell. But then up on the top right, you can see a little bit of a picture of what would have been a first century synagogue that was found. And we'll talk a little more about that specifically here in a few minutes, but a dig for a first century synagogue that's right beside, and they only found it because they were building a large motel-like home for underprivileged individuals. They began to do the dig to lay the foundation, and all of a sudden they found a synagogue. When you're doing construction in the Middle East, evidently, I've been told that is not uncommon to all of a sudden try and dig a foundation, and then you just find something that you were not expecting. And then off on the right side there, the largest picture on the screen, is one of the old city gates, or one of the old gates to the old city of Jerusalem. So that's one of the multiple entrances going into what is considered the old city proper. The modern city of Jerusalem extends far beyond the city walls that are up because it's continued to grow. But many of the walls going back at least until the time of the Crusades are still standing. Some of the walls going back even further than then. But so some of those most all but one of the gates are still in use to this day. And I'll also talk a little bit about why that one gate isn't. So in this world where there's lots of old, but yet people are growing, people need places to live, people want to build shops, people want to do all these things, there's also this desire to preserve and recreate what's old that's left there. And something that I had no idea was part of it. The bottom right corner, you see a sign that says Restoration Line. And so we visited several different places where there had been digs for like cities, for synagogues, for various other, especially first century and even earlier remains. And so the typical practice over there when you find something that old is that you establish a line, because you don't find them intact. You find small portions of walls, of buildings, of things, and you find rock all around it that fell from where that wall had been. But what the archaeologists do is they then put a line either through that right there, there's a beam of wood and cement where the restoration line sign is, and the picture above it is simply a black line in the cement above it. But everything below the line is original and has not been disturbed since it was created, whether that be 2,000 some years ago or in some cases up to 3,000 some years ago. But everything below it has been preserved, and what they do for the rubble that's around it, that they know is part of it, to the best that they understand what that is, what the place is, they will reconstruct what's above it. And so you'll have reconstructions of larger walls. The upper right corner, that is actually I want to get the name, what we would think of like a bathhouse type deal at Masada, so one of the Jewish fortresses. It was a bathhouse for one of the Jewish rulers around the time of Christ, a little bit after. But it's one of the rooms that would be filled up with water where folks would be able to go and to bathe. And so everything below it is exactly how it was, including that little fresco painting. You can see a little bit of color towards the bottom part, towards that corner. And so that is all original, all that's been left to us that we can then do our best to preserve. And then there's also the painting, or the picture to the left is not a preservation in the sense of that was left standing. That is a replica right there of what is believed to be how a first century synagogue would have looked. So somewhere that Jesus would have walked into when he was going on the Sabbath on Saturday to go to synagogue. What would one of those places have looked like? And I showed you a small picture earlier of what a dig of one looked like, but this was a recreation in a place called Nazareth Village. It was in the town of Nazareth, but it was a small swath of land that had been set aside by a nonprofit group, a number of Christian organizations and others contributing towards it, to where they did their best to recreate what the village of Nazareth could have looked like, including having craftsmen, including also having a synagogue, and what would it have looked like, what would a tomb have looked like. That, I don't believe we have a picture of that here, but there was also a recreation of what a tomb for where you would put someone when they were buried in the town, what that would look like, what the vineyard would look like. And we had an opportunity to walk through and just to see what an average everyday life would be. And so just some things to mention about the synagogue. As you can see at the very center of the picture, there's what looks like a podium. And that's exactly where the Torah scroll would be laid out for the readings for that day. So like how we would put our Bibles here on the podium to then read. For the ancient Jew, for the priest or for the teacher, they would lay out the scroll there. And you can't see it from this picture, but there are, since they'd be large scrolls, they weren't small like our Bibles today. We can fit Bibles in our pockets now. The scrolls for their texts were enormous. But where they would set them, there would also be little curved out edges to where then the rolled up rolls could set. It wouldn't be rolled off. Because if you set, say, some paper towels on its side here, easily enough it can be knocked off and rolled away. And so you wouldn't want that to happen to your sacred text. And so they carved out some grooves to where they could set and easily leave the texts that were to be read and to taught from. And so you have that. And then if you look carefully, you'll also notice that there are some folks sitting on the other side, and surrounding a synagogue of that time period, there would have been, instead of pews like we would have today, imagine if the pews just went all around the sanctuary. And you've got multiple levels where folks can sit at the bottom, as you see up there, and they can sit closer to the top, but they're surrounding. As opposed to facing one direction, they're all facing each other. And that's because also the synagogues, and so there wasn't a McDonald's or a coffee shop or a Walmart to go socialize at in the first century. So the synagogue, essentially, for a Jewish community, was the community center. It was the center of the community, the life of the community of the Jewish folks. And so they would go there on the Sabbath for teaching, of course, but then during the week, people would gather there. They would meet at the synagogue. When you had a rabbi in the area, they would meet there with their students, and they would teach them around the outsides of the synagogue, or I should say, sitting on the outsides, on the inside there. And so this was the place where everyone got together. This was where the community talked about what was going on, where if things needed to happen, they could gather and talk about situations that may have come down from the governors or their prefect or whoever was ruling them. This was the place. And so that's also something that, for me, kind of came alive to think about, that synagogues weren't simply like the church sanctuary, just where maybe on Sundays where we have service, but for them, their place of worship was also their place of everyday life. It was where they did life with each other in the community. And so that was just kind of powerful to think about, that for them, the doors didn't close after the Sabbath and wait till the next Saturday, but it was where all parts of their community were based out of and they would come back to. And so, again, that's been a recreation of what we believe would be a first century synagogue. And something else very interesting about it is that, you know how we put windows right at about, arm level or right around here, kind of like how we have them here, not very high up usually. The only windows there are at the very top. There are these cutouts all the way up there. And that's because, and I was wondering, why would you do that? You can't see out of something that high. And then someone reminded me, heat rises. And so these buildings stay very cool because the cool air that's around stays inside and the hot air goes up and out. And so while we were in there, there was probably at least a 20-degree difference between being outside and walking into that replica, because naturally the hot air just escaped and went back outside. And so it wouldn't be unbearable to be inside, because again, we're living in a time before air conditioning, a time before we can set the temperature to wherever we want. But they were intelligent folks. They figured out how to make that work. And so they knew if they put the windows up there, it'll just escape. So, but those are just some examples of many of the different things and how they're preserved and what they've been able to recreate over there for us to be able to even better imagine what life back in the first century especially looked like. Now, I'm going to talk just for a few moments now about the smallness of the world over there. And I've mentioned this briefly at the beginning, but everything is so close. And like you look on the map and you're like, okay, things are pretty close. We were going from our hotel in Jerusalem. We went over the hill and then we were in Bethlehem. I wasn't expecting that. And so all of a sudden my mind's kind of shattered in just thinking about, okay, hold on. Things are, you can actually walk places and it wouldn't be absolutely unbearable to go there. It's not even as far from here to Lenoir to get from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. Everything is just so close together, and we don't think about that as much because we, especially in America, we're a little more spread out. The cities are a little further away. You have to do a 20-minute drive between each other. And we hear about, a day's journey and all, but when we really think about it, a day's journey is not incredibly far, just at a general walking pace. And so when you're looking at it, especially going from the modern perspective, being able to drive somewhere, all of a sudden you kind of realize how close together things are, but also how hard it was to even travel the distances sometimes. You had to be intentional. You couldn't just, I forgot this at the grocery store. I got to run back over there. Let me hop in the car. No, when you went to town to get things, you had to make sure you got everything and before you went back outside of the city. And so, and the one thing that also absolutely stood out to me in this picture, and this, when Dr. Kanoy came up beside me, we were standing on a little mountain off to the side of Jerusalem, looking over on Jerusalem, because it's basically on the top of another mount. And over there, now, when I'm saying mountain, I should clarify. Mountain does not mean the same thing there that it means here. When you say mountain over there, it's kind of like a hill over here. And so everything's a little bit relative with that. So when we're on one hill looking at another hill of Jerusalem, he says, all right, let me show you this. And he proceeds to show me within this view the entire last night of Jesus Christ before he is to be crucified. My world was shattered because I'd imagined the story growing up, but I think every time the scene changed, It's like, when you're watching an episode and it goes on TV and you got one thing happening and then it fades out and fades back in. That's how it always happened in my mind. I'm imagining what's going on. I'm imagining them in the upper room having Passover, and then Judas leaving, but then I'm just like, okay, he's gone. He's just poof, he's there. He's wherever else he is. And just follow a little bit with me. I know you can't see it super well, but there's a gray dome off to the left. You go up just a little ways, and you come to the building where that is believed to have been the general area for where the Last Supper would have been had. And just a few blocks down from that, towards that gray dome, is where Caiaphas' house was. And so you have Judas, walks out the house, goes down a couple blocks to Caiaphas. And then he's doing that. Jesus and the rest of the disciples come down the same road, out a city gate that is towards, just below where that gray dome is, goes down the hillside where you see kind of those little dotted trees there, over to the middle right of the picture, which is where the Garden of Gethsemane is. Not very far away. For whatever reason, when I imagined this story, they went down a valley, up another hill, and they went somewhere very secluded. But it's just right across the valley from where they were at, just outside the city gates. Really at the base, going up just barely the other side. And then Judas, the priests, and all their folks, they come down the same way Jesus went, and they take him right back up the same way, up the same gate, and then they cross and go over right about to the far right side of the screen there, where Pilate's quarters were. Now, just to get an idea, this probably would take you maybe 20 minutes walking at most, and that was when we were in crowds to get from one side to the other. So in the middle of the night, that might have been a 15-minute walk to get from Caiaphas' house over to the Roman officials' quarters. And so just thinking about just that little portion of the night of Christ, all of a sudden I was like, wow, this is the place. This is it. But it's so small. But then, as I'm thinking about just things like that and the smallness of it, and I use smallness just because that's how it seemed, I then was forced to think about the ministry of Jesus. Because I guess I also, in my imagination, and everywhere Jesus is going, he's going here and yonder, he's going far. And I'd been told at some point he wasn't going all that far. Jesus was staying pretty local. But until I could even visualize just his last night, or traveling from Galilee to Jerusalem, it really didn't hit me as to really how close to home he was the whole time. Jesus was never more than a few days' journey from where he would have called home. And so for me, that became mind-blowing and really challenging for me in thinking about what I do. I'm at the School of Divinity. I'm trying to understand how this church stuff works and how we're on mission for God and for the gospel. And it kind of hit me that the person that we follow, our salvation, Jesus Christ, never went very far from home in his ministry and what he was doing. He ministered to the folks that were all nearby to him that would have had a pretty good idea of who he was, especially after just a couple years of his ministry. Word spreads fast. It's not hard to go from one hill to the other to spread. But just in thinking of the smallness of the world, it kind of challenged me to think about, because we always think about, and it's always important to support those going here and yonder, going far and abroad, because there are those called to do that, and we should support them absolutely. But it also challenged me in thinking about, what am I doing really close to home? And I just recently had moved out from living on campus and where my job as a graduate resident director, I was living with the undergrads, and all of a sudden now I had neighbors and it kind of hit me, I was like, I don't know my neighbors. I don't know who they are. How can I even think of ministering to them in any way in my little corner of the world if I don't even know their name? And so those are just some thoughts that after having that brief moment with Dr. Kanoy, just seeing kind of that story come alive, that was kind of the thought that ended up remaining with me, is that so much happens, so much can happen in such a little space, if we'll let it. So, but that's just a few tidbits on the area. And so, but what you're looking at here is the old city of Jerusalem. So there's a wall that you can see just going around the side there, coming across the front of the screen, and it takes a turn backwards right there, right around where the gray dome is. But that is the old city walls that go back many, many years, would probably not have been, were not the walls that were exactly where Jesus would have known them. Those are just a little bit lower in the ground from where those are right now. But these are walls that are definitely dated back to Crusader time and before, but are still in the same places, built on top of the older walls that were there. And that's the other thing that's also to be realized. Things are continually built on top of one another. There's always layers and layers of things that once one massive wipeout happens, people come back and they build up again. So once things are destroyed, you just rebuild on top of it. And so it's not uncommon to go to a site where you have a 100-year chunk of stuff, then all of a sudden you see things a little bit differently. Things don't look quite the same. That's because before whatever you found first, there was stuff that was there even earlier. And so you just have to keep digging to see what all history you could find. But segueing into the rich history, there is, again, I could come here 5 or 10 more times for an hour to 2 hours each and cover only a portion of the rich history that's over there. And so I'm going to attempt to do at least a little bit of it justice. And so the pictures that you see right up here, the upper right corner, which I wish I'd made just a little bit bigger for you to see, but it is from Capernaum, from the ancient city of Capernaum, which many of you all may be familiar with as the place where Paul was held prisoner before headed to Rome. And there was actually a space there that is believed to have been the prison cell that Paul would have been in, because on the little isthmus going out towards the water are prison cells. And so based on what's there with the location, it's a pretty good guess that one of them was where Paul was kept before being sent off to Caesar. But what we're looking at there is where the chariot races would happen. So right up against the water is a long stretch of land, but there's some build-up in the middle, and there's a grandstand on one side. And that's where the folks from the town and the Roman citizens and all the folks from around would come and watch the gladiator fights and also watch the races of folks going around in chariots. And so even in places like that have been very well preserved by Mother Nature, and then by also just the various coverings of them, but over time have become uncovered, and folks have been able to find and then keep well preserved as well. The middle picture there is again a picture of the first century synagogue. There should be another slide here shortly that we'll look at that just a little bit more in depth. But right below it, the one in the middle, the larger picture, that is taken from Qumran, which Qumran, for just so that you know, Qumran is where what really is the treasure trove of archaeology was found. The once-in-a-lifetime discovery of what folks have called the Dead Sea Scrolls. So these ancient texts that have many of our books from the Bible perfectly preserved, some of them entirely as we have them, others in fragments from this community at Qumran, which is not very far away from the Dead Sea. But it's in this cave right here, in just pottery. There were scrolls being preserved by a group called the Essenes, who lived there and studied scriptures, predominantly the Old Testament, because that would have been the time they were around the first century. Those were the scriptures of the days. And they also had writings of their own that were preserved at that time. Now, these were found simply by happenstance. There was a shepherd watching sheep, and one sheep goes away, falls into, and you can't see it here, but there is an opening at the top of that little hill there, and falls into there. And so he's trying to figure out if the sheep's still alive to be able to go get it. He throws a rock down there, and he just hears clank, pottery breaking after he tosses the rock down there. And so he doesn't know what's going on. So he goes down there. He finds the sheep, but he also just finds all of this pottery and all of this text, all of these writings. He doesn't know what they are. And the way that it was written, it was on animal hide. It was because that was one of the ways that you would write on, that you would keep writings, would be on animal hide. And so it was very good quality. And so, as any person would do, he starts to take that piece by piece, ripping it apart into town to the cobbler, selling it to the cobbler for a little bit of money. Because when you find something like, you don't give it all at once. You take a little bit and you get some money. Then you take a little bit more and you get some money. And it wasn't until, we don't know how much he had ripped up already, until all of a sudden some of it started to pop up on the black market, and then all of a sudden people realized what was there. And so they would go in and take it and find it. That was one of the great archaeological finds, were those texts, those copies of the Old Testament books, and then the other writings from the folks at Qumran. Now the photo on the right is also an incredible one. While we were in Jerusalem, one of the great opportunities was to be able to go to the Wailing Wall, which you'll see another picture of it here shortly. But at the Wailing Wall, as many of you may know, some of you may not, the men are directed to one area, and the women are directed to another area at the Wailing Wall. And that's part of their practice. But you go there to offer prayer. And the Wailing Wall, or also known as the Western Wall, is a wall that dates back to the Second Temple period. So it dates back to the Second Temple and is actually the last intact portion of the Second Temple of the Jews. But right there, what you're looking into is a glass pane. And on the male side, there's an entrance into an underground area where there are enormous Torah scrolls and books on Torah and interpretation of the Torah, the Jewish text. And there's that glass pane where they have dug down to what is believed to be the foundations and some of the foundation stones of the first temple, of Solomon's temple. And so they have dug down that far, but they can't do any more digging other than that, because there's now a ban on the Temple Mount area to where no one can dig, mainly for concerns of someone doing something such as attempting to harm others or to blow something up. And so there is now no longer, and also concern over who would find what and what they might do, and how, if they would keep it or give it back to who it should be given to. And so there's no more digging, but they've been able to dig down to, and so you can look down and see what would be the foundations of Solomon's temple. And so being able to go there and to see that, it really boggles my mind a little bit to think about that kind of history, that kind of context for thinking about this was where it was at. This was where this story about David wanting to build a temple, but God saying, no, your son's going to build it. This was the place where God told Solomon to build his house, to build the house of God. And it was on this little piece of area. It's incredible. It's incredible to think about that kind of space. I'll talk a little bit more about that just in a second. Again, here's Capernaum, a better picture of Capernaum, of the area. Again, the one on the right is where the chariot races would happen. And so the Romans, just like us in America, we love our sports. The Romans loved theirs as well. And so they had these in most of the major cities. This is the example of the one in Capernaum, right next to the water where the port would be also. And then off on the right side is what is believed to be the jail cell of Paul. And then there's a little plaque there as well with a passage from Acts, I appeal unto Caesar, and just a little description about that location. And so that's just a little bit more about the area of Capernaum. Now, what is here is again now the first, what is believed to have been a first century synagogue in a little town now in modern day called Migdal, but called Magdala. Now, think about the word Magdala. There's a character in the New Testament. There's an individual that's related to. That's Mary Magdalene. This is the town that Mary Magdalene would have been from. And so, it is entirely possible and highly likely that this synagogue that's been found here, that Jesus would have walked into because of his close connections with that family and it being very close to where he would have grown up. Because this is right on the Sea of Galilee, up in that region of Tiberias. And so what you're seeing there is, again, very similar to the recreation at the Nazareth village. If you can tell, there's a rectangle going around the sides where there would have been seating for individuals. And then on the left, I've got a zoomed-in picture of what would have been where the scroll would have been laid. You can see just a little bit better on that one how there's a little bit of a curve and dip on the sides to be able to hold those writings. And so you can almost think back in the Gospels when we hear the story of Jesus coming to the synagogue and reading from Isaiah, that this very well could have been the place where he read from, where he came to study the Scriptures. Incredible. Sacred spaces. The synagogue is an example of an ancient sacred space. But also, just like there's lots of old and lots of new, there's also old and new sacred spaces throughout Israel, and especially in the city of Jerusalem. There are 3 different religious traditions, 3 different faiths that all converge here. This is a holy city for Christians, this is a holy city for Jews, and this is also a holy city for those of the Muslim faith. And so you have just this incredible mixture of folks coming in. And while we were there, actually, it was the month of Ramadan, which is the month of fasting for those of the Muslim faith. And we were actually in Jerusalem the last week of Ramadan, and on the last Friday of Ramadan, everyone from the surrounding area comes in to worship on the Temple Mount at their mosque there. And this is the only reason we were riding the train that day. It was our afternoon free, and we were going to go explore the city. There were no cabs, there were no buses, there was no transportation outside the light rail unless you were traveling into the old city for worship that Friday afternoon for Friday afternoon prayer. And so it was an absolutely massive event, and we were walking through the old city a little bit while it was happening, and it was just the amount of people and just their desire to go into worship was an atmosphere unparalleled. But what we have here is also, you see towards the middle at the top is a further out picture of the Wailing Wall, and you can kind of see a little fence between where on the left is where the men go, and on the right are where the women go. But then you're encouraged to go, and you pray, and you put prayers in at the wall, and that is something that both pilgrims from near and far go, and also what Jews who live there go and do. And there's a room off to the side. You can see another wall off on the left. There's a little cutout, and there's a room in there where then teaching by rabbis is still done in that room as well. Now, directly below it is one of the many, many, many churches over in Israel. There are churches commemorating virtually every event in the life of Jesus. There are churches all over maintained by any number of Christian denominations. And I'll talk just a little bit more about them here shortly, but I also want to point out that upper left corner, that gray dome. Now, that's not the gray dome you saw in the picture earlier. This is a smaller dome on the Temple Mount, near the Dome of the Rock, which is the Golden Dome building there that I just mentioned. But this gray dome is commemorating something different. This gray dome is believed to be on top of where the Holy of Holies stood in the temple. So right there, just off on the other side from where the picture of the Dome of the Rock is taken, is where the Holy of Holies in both the first and the second temple was, in that one little spot. And there's that one dome there to commemorate it. And so this space, the Temple Mount, people coming from all over to see these sacred spaces for Christians and Jews and Muslims, all coming to this place to see this rich history. For us, it's to see where God was at work in the Jews in the time before Christ, and then to come see where Christ was walking and teaching and being, and would eventually be our atoning sacrifice. But to be able to see where that was is just incredible. And as I mentioned, the Temple Mount, we got the Dome of the Rock, the Holy of Holies, and the Western Wall, as mentioned. But there's a sealed gate. And did I leave that? I did. I left that picture. So there's another gate right there. If you're looking at the wall, you got the gold dome, come down to the wall, and there's that little extra piece there on the right, about 2/3 towards the right. That is a sealed gate. And that was sealed back at the time of the Crusades, during one of the times when the Muslims had control over the city of Jerusalem. And they sealed that gate, and they put a graveyard in front of it. And I had no idea what was going on when Dr. Kanoy was talking about that, so I'm like, why did they do that? Well, it's believed in the Jewish faith, because for those that practice Judaism, they don't believe the Messiah has come yet. They don't believe in Christ. They don't believe that he has come as the Messiah. And so they're still awaiting the Messiah. And it is their belief that the Messiah is going to come through that sealed gate, that is the gate he's supposed to come through, and to come into the temple, because the Holy of Holies is directly lined up with that sealed gate. I'm like, okay, the sealed gate makes sense, but why the graveyard? In the Jewish faith, you're never supposed to walk over dead bodies. And so they believed, all right, we'll put graves there, we'll seal the gate, no respecting Jew is going to walk that way. So for them, they're like, all right, we have ended the hope for a Messiah for the Jews, is the Muslim belief, that no one's going to try to do that they're not going to be a Messiah attempting to do that. And so just a little bit of kind of how there's tensions between the Muslims and the Jews, especially in the city, but they're also kind of coexisting one with another. An interesting thing to also know, the Temple Mount is not maintained by anyone in Israel. The Temple Mount is maintained by the nation of Jordan, just to that'd be the east of Israel. And so the king of Jordan and the country of Jordan maintains the Temple Mount. They maintain guards up there. They maintain its upkeep. And so that's generally how that goes. No one there maintains it themselves. Another interesting sacred space, especially for us, is the Garden Tomb. Now, there are two places that are marked as the tomb of Christ. One is housed in a church, and I'll mention that one in just a second. The other is the Garden Tomb. And really, the Garden Tomb is the most likely place where it would have been, just because of its proximity to Calvary, towards the area where Jesus would have been crucified, and just the general skull-like feature of the nearby rocks, because that's one of the descriptions of where Christ was crucified. And so, but there's a garden tomb, and I've got a diagram of the tomb right there on the right, a picture of us on the outside, and then a picture facing where you would have laid the body on the inside. But you walk in, and the entrance is maybe 3 feet high, so you've really got to duck in there. And you go to this main room. It's marked by 6 on the diagram. But it's this area where you prepare the body. You prepare the body over there, and then you eventually take it over to that little alcove for it to be laid. And then you'll come back a number of days later and finish preparing the body and lay it to rest in that space as well. And so just to be able to go in there and to think, this is where Christ would have been laid. This is the space. This is a holy place. This is where Christ was laid. That's where he didn't remain. That's where he was placed. And because I'd always imagined this giant hole in the side of a mountain with an enormous boulder, which to seal up right there would take a boulder about 5 feet wide, which is going to be very heavy. But I always imagined something about 10 feet wide or something like that. But all of a sudden, the world began to morph in my imagination as to what all this was actually like. And so just to have kind of an idea, to to be able to visualize that. It's incredible. And then, as I mentioned, there's also a number of churches, holy sites for all kinds of Christian denominations, maintained by so many different denominations, especially the Franciscan order. They maintain these churches, they maintain the facilities, and it is just absolutely incredible. The churches that we have in America are of nothing of comparison to the churches there. We were in one of them in the city of Jerusalem, and we were downstairs in a lower area where it was believed when an individual did some Bible translation. As we were coming up, there was a group singing there. I was just overcome in the beauty of the sound. And I was talking about it later, and I was reminded that when churches were constructed, especially back around the 1000s, before and after, around that time, which would mean these were made, they were built with such acoustic precision to where, because they believed it was very important that you could hear everything, and that also the music that was sung there would be carried in such an incredible way. And so there are churches all over. We could talk for even days just on the various churches that are there and their traditions. But there is one that's interesting. It's the upper right corner. It's the other place that is debated as to where Christ was crucified and buried. But it's maintained by 7 different churches. Now, if you know anything about church life, churches always get along, right? There's never a disagreement in the room. But these 7, they're the outliers. They can never agree on anything. So much so, they can't even hold the keys to the church because everyone wanted to have the keys. So they had to give the keys to a Muslim family who to this day is in charge of opening the church because they can't quite get along. And so that's just kind of a humorous point from the trip. But this is, and then one final thing here as we're wrapping up, this is the Church of all nations. I have the Church of the Nations, also known as Church of all nations, where many of the nations of the world contributed to the various artwork, art pieces, and just the construction of it. And it was just incredible to walk in there and to see so many different people from so many different places around the world worshiping and praying. To see the world come together in that way in this space, it's breathtaking. It's breathtaking. So some brief reflections from my time over there. Again, collision of worlds. Everything coming together, modern, ancient, people from all over coming in. It's a little overwhelming. But thankfully, go in with folks that have done this before. They help you process these things. And then also, I'm able to imagine the Bible stories, and as I read them in ways like I never could before, to actually be able to okay, this is what the area looked like. This is what a few days' journey kind of would have looked like, going from here to here. Never be able to see them the same again. And again, seeing history is powerful. We talk about going and visiting various places across the country, folks that will go to Revolutionary War sites, Civil War sites, just to see where history happened. It's so powerful to go to those places. I'd say just as much so, even more so, to be able to see where the events of our Bible took place. And then it has me thinking about, what are our sacred places, or sacred spaces here in America? What are those for me, and what are those for each of us? Because those churches, those synagogues, the Temple Mount, there was always a dress code. There was always expectations of how you were conduct yourself while you were there. What are those spaces for us? What are those spaces that are so sacred, that we hold so dear? And part of me is still wrestling, do we have them? Now, no, we're not in the Holy Land, but what places do we treat as so important? And then it has me thinking, just generally about, again, the smallness of the world and our responsibility to our close-by communities, and then to our churches as well. So, that is, at best as I can describe it, highlights of the highlights of Israel. I wish the video would have worked, but it gave us a little bit more time to talk this evening.
Repeat the question. We have time for a couple.
All right.
If you can hear, if you repeat it so everybody can hear the question.
Absolutely. So we do have a few minutes here before 8 o'clock, and so I just want to open the floor up. Does anyone have any questions about anything I've said, anything I haven't said, or anything you've just always been curious about of Israel? Or maybe not? Yeah.
Does the entire city have electricity in all the homes?
So asking about electricity, does the entire city have electricity? Now, are you talking about Jerusalem especially? So yes, I would say that's at least capable of doing it. Every home in the city of Jerusalem could have electricity. Now, just like many homes here in America, there are some folks that are poor and just can't afford things like that as well. And so, but there are all the modern conveniences of electricity, of cell phones, of computers, of all those kinds of things, of running water, of toilet systems, all of that is there as well. Yeah, absolutely. Good question, though. Any other questions? Yes?
Is everything very commercialized? Does that take away from your experience?
So she asked, is everything commercialized? And does that take away from the experience of going there? And I would say, yes, things are, well, I should say it this way. Commercialized wouldn't be how I would say it. There's a lot of commercialization there. There's a lot of, every place you go has got a gift shop. Every place you go has got some souvenirs you can buy. But there's also such an incredible appreciation and respect for certain places where there's kind of a boundary. Like those things happen at entranceways, but those things don't happen at the spaces. And so it's kind of there, and you've also got street peddlers and things like that around as well. But the sacred sites are maintained with high respect because everyone going there is seeking to be able to worship or to experience it. And so they're able to maintain them, and so you don't lose that experience. Yeah, once you're leaving out there, there's some stuff. But the main space, especially the churches especially, there's none of that in the church. That is completely outside of it. So yeah. Really? Oh, that's going to be incredible. I'm so excited for you. That'll be wonderful. How long will you be there? Wow. Wow. 7 days.
I know you don't want to close, but we have to because I know some of you got children in the RAs and the GAs and different things downstairs. I want him to very quickly, everybody's always, they say it's a good time and a bad time to go, and there's scary things over there sometimes. Tell them what your professor said about Walmart.
So Dr. Kanoy told us at one of our first meetings when people were asking, how is it over there? Are we actually going to be safe? He said that he felt safer some nights walking in the dark of Jerusalem than he did walking in the dead of night at Walmart in Shelby. So, yeah.
And, there's always a possibility if we have enough enters that we could get a group up from Union Grove to go. So just think about it and pray about it. Let's give him a hand of appreciation for being here tonight.
Thank you. Glad to be here.